The formal start of World War II occurred on the Westerplatte peninsula near Gdańsk. Westerplatte was Henryk Sieciarski. His second-in-command was Captain Franciszek Dabrowski. There was also Captain Mieczysław Slavy, Lieutenant Leon Pajak, Lieutenant Stefan Ludwik Grodecki, and Second Lieutenant Zdzislaw Krzygielski present as leading figure. Most of the garrison soldiers drawn from the elite 2nd Legion's infantry division, only 27 men were reservists. The garrison was small, but the terrain heavily favored the defense. Although Germans could overlook Westerplatte from many points, the depot is surrounded by a wall and was heavily wooded. In terms of defensive armament, Sieciarski's company-sized detachment was armed with as much firepower as a Polish infantry battalion, including one elderly 75mm field gun, two 37mm anti-tank guns, 4 81mm mortars and 41 machine guns. Due to dense tree cover on Westerplatte and the clever construction of bunkers beneath buildings, the Germans could not observe most of Sieciarski defenses. The Germans did conduct aerial reconnaissance flights over Westerplatte, but were still uncertain about the strength of its defenses. Around noon on August 31st, a general staff officer named Podpułkownik Wincenty Sobocinski arrived and privately told Major Sieciarski that the intervention corps had been disbanded and that there would be no reinforcement in event of war. In that case, Sieciarski was ordered to hold Westerplatte for 12 hours. On the German side, fighting would be done by the SS Heimwehr force of 1,500 men led by Police General Friedrich Eberhard. He had some 225 crack Marines, under Lieutenant Henningsen, to spearhead any attack on the depot. Overall command would rest with Rear Admiral Gustav Kleikamp, whose flagship Schleswig-Holstein, built in 1908, was officially on a courtesy visit in Danzig. It had anchored on the southern embankment of the harbor canal at Neuferwasser during the morning of August 25, only 164 yards away. Kleikamp moved his ship further upstream on August 26, to be in a better position to fire on Westerplatte. The guns of the ship were in full view, there is no hiding them. When the order came, they would storm the depot. The final hour of Danzig crisis approaching silently. During the night of August 31 and September 1, the crew of pre-dreadnought battleship Schleswig-Holstein were waiting anxiously, while Henningsen's naval detachment was landed on the eastern side of the Westerplatte Peninsula around 2 a.m. At 4:30 a.m. the Matrosen, the ordinary German sailor, closed up at action stations. The 28 cm main turrets of Schleswig-Holstein, known simply as SX by her men, swung around to train on the Westerplatte. Captain zur See Gustav Kleikamp clutched an order of the day from Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine. The hour of the decision finds us ready to respond for honor, right and the freedom of our fatherland, the Gross Admiral proclaimed. That salvo's time has been variously stated as 4:45, 4:47, or 4:48. Polish historian Jaroslav Taliska explains that 4:45 was the planned time, 4:47 was the time the order was given by Kleikamp, and 4:48 was the time the guns actually fired. The thunder came from the guns of Schleswig-Holstein 3 miles to north. At 4:47 a.m. Gustav Kleikamp gave the order, Los! Open fire! For the next 7 minutes the guns boomed, unleashing 67 28 cm and 15 cm shells and 600 rounds from the 20 mm pom-pom guns. Trees were sliced in half, every window in the barracks shattered instantly, wooden buildings on the Westerplatte disintegrated, then went up in flames as fuel barrels were ignited by the shells impacting. It's as if all hell is let loose, thunder and lightning, huge fountains of earth and flames crash among the fortifications, naval correspondent Fritz Otto Busch observed. Schleswig-Holstein soon resembles a mountain, spewing flames enveloped in a brown-yellow dust and clouds of smoke. However, the ship's 2 twin 28 cm gun torrents only fire 4 rounds each per minute, and the time of flight was so short that most of the rounds did not have time to arm. Instead, the 240 kilograms high explosive projectiles smashed into ground, in great clouds of dirt. Yet amazingly, the 7-minute naval bombardment inflicted no casualties on Polish garrison. It did succeed in setting a nearby German-owned oil storage facility on fire. Polish airwaves crackled with a short message, SOS, I am being attacked. There was no time to encrypt it. The defenders of the peninsula donned gas masks and waited for the Germans to come. Johannes Schaefer took the booming of the battleship's guns as his signal. His SS troops swept into Danzig's central station, dashing from the side streets. The building was taken without a shot being fired. Not so at the signal box. The Polish railway workers fired back with rifles. Surrounded, they were soon overcome. Schaefer arrived to see his prize, stepping over the bodies of dead Poles, lying in pools of their own blood, at the signal box's entrance. The roar of Schleswig-Holstein's guns woke the staff of the Polish post office in Heveliusplatz. The director ran through its corridors yelling, "Get to your posts! Get to your posts!" Almost simultaneously, the building was rocked as an explosive charge went off, ripping a hole in a fence which separated the post office's courtyard from the neighboring police station. Rifle fire from a house in a nearby street strafed the post office as armed police tried to force their way inside through 3 different entrances. The 3 defenders responded with 3 Browning light machine guns and pistols, hurling grenades at their attackers. Police and SS Heimwehr Danzig troops forced their way into the lobby of the parcel depot until they were driven back by a combination of pistol fire and grenades. The first abortive assault on the post office had cost the Germans 2 dead and half a dozen wounded. Near the small town of Kreuzberg-Hauptmann, Johann Graf von Kielmansegge noticed that 0 hour came and went almost without incident. The pioneers and infantry crossed the river in whatever boat they could find and secured the opposite bank. It was a good 10 minutes before the Poles responded with the weak rattle of rifle fire. Then the crash of explosions, and in the distance, small white clouds rose in the early morning sky. The Poles had blown up bridges in the division's first objective, Panki. It was just before 5 a.m. when the 1st Naval Infantry moved off against the Westerplatte, advancing 500 or so yards before the Poles brought fire to bear on the German troops. A second group of shock troops succeeded in breaching the wall, but it was as far as the men got. Once more, Polish fire poured down on the attackers. Wild machine gun fire bursts out, rifle shots rattle, and hand grenades explode, as Fritz Otto Busch observed. 2 Polish soldiers were killed in the brief action, including 39-year-old Sergeant Wojciech Naczarek, probably the first Polish military death in Second World War. The Germans had also established a number of machine gun positions across the channel and opened heavy suppressive fire on Westerplatte. However, around 5:15 a.m. the Poles got their 75mm field gun into position and silenced several machine gun positions. The Poles also used their 37mm anti-tank gun to fire at Schleswig-Holstein and almost knocked out its command post. At the same time, Polish 81mm mortars fired over 100 rounds, pounders the perimeter area where the MSK was still lurking. Having been repulsed, Henningsen radioed frantically to the Kleikamp that Verlust zu groß, gehen zur. Barely 90 minutes after the assault began, the company broke off its attack and pulled back. Its losses had been too great. "We knew nothing about the enemy," Feldwebel Heinz Denker recalled bitterly. "We possessed only an old map, without the pillboxes marked on it. We immediately noticed that the ship's barrage had been ineffective. The huge 280mm shells needed to travel 600 meters to explode. In fact, they had traveled just 400 meters. The only useful purpose the projectiles served in many cases was to provide cover for the attacking Marines. Although Westerplatte was on fire, but it remained firmly in Polish hands. But Gustav Kleikamp was not prepared to give up the attempt to seize it after a single assault. A second attempt would be made, but not before a much heavier barrage. SX's guns opened fire once more, for 30 minutes without end. There was a brief pause, then the muzzles of the old battleship flashed again. This time 90-28 centimeters, 47-15 centimeters, and 366 8.8 centimeters rounds fired. Luckily for Germans, an 8.8 centimeters round succeeded in knocking out the pesky Polish 75mm field gun. Just before 9 a.m., the Marines moved off once more, this time supported by 60 armed SS personnel, the Heimwehr Danzig. Painfully slowly, the troops advanced over barbed wire, tripped wire, and branches brought down by Schleswig-Holstein's bombardment. At first the Poles were slow to react, but once again the machine guns opened up. Not once did the attacking troops see an enemy soldier. The defenders were too well hidden in their bunkers and gun positions camouflaged with turf. Nevertheless, the attackers continued probing, despite snipers in the Westerplatte's trees picking off the hapless German troops. By noon, it was clear that the MSK lacked the strength to breach this position, and Henningsen began to pulling his men back. During the retreat he was mortally wounded. Sieczarski's troops had inflicted about 136 casualties upon the German assault troops, at a cost of only 3 Polish soldiers killed in action. The Westerplatte would not fall by a coup de main, and Eberhard, who was not keen on wasting more troops on this objective, decided to ask for more firepower. He called for Luftwaffe support, but none was available due to the cloud cover over Danzig. Everywhere on the first day of battle German troops had punctured the Polish lines, in Pomerania, in the corridor, in Silesia, in the Carpathians. In places the enemy had offered battle, but invariably the invader had skirmished briefly with his foe, and his foe had fallen back. Only on the Westerplatte, where this fledgling conflict had begun, did the sense of success elude the attacker. Every attack against the peninsula had been repulsed for the cost of just 3 dead. Henryk Sieczarski, the garrison's commander, was pleased. Battle-hardened veterans had stiffened the resolve of his younger troops. In each man there was a feeling of having won the first battle. With dawn on the second they waited for the attacker to come once more. But he did not. Requests for Luftwaffe air support still met with no success, since bombing Westerplatte was not a priority for Luftflotte 1. Major Sieczarski also called for air support, but at this point Polish High Command had clearly written of Westerplatte's tiny garrison and was not going to commit resources to a perceived lost cause. Finally the Luftwaffe agreed to Eberhard's request in the late afternoon of September 2nd, and over 50 Stukas from STG-2 Immelmann began a 30-minute attack at 6:05 p.m. Altogether, about 26 tons of bombs were dropped at Westerplatte, a very concentrated attack on a small target. On this occasion the Stukas also demonstrated pinpoint accuracy, demolishing 1 guard house and damaging the barracks. 10 Polish soldiers were killed and 6 wounded. Sieczarski was in the barracks when he was hit by 50 kilograms bombs, which badly rattled him. Henryk Sieczarski had lost his mind. The 40-year-old was a career soldier, a veteran of the Italian front with the Austro-Hungarian army in the Great War. But 2 days of intense bombardment had shattered the commander's nerves. As his deputy captain Franciszek Dabrowski observed, he was shaking and blubbering, his lips were foaming. Sieczarski ordered the white flag hoisted and began burning all his secret papers. His officers mutinied. The Westerplatte's doctor was summoned. Henryk Sieczarski was strapped to a bed, a stick thrust between his teeth. The white flag was lowered, and resistance resumed. It is also clear that Dabrowski led the defense for the next 5 days, not Sieczarski. The Germans should have followed up the Stuka attack with another ground assault while the garrison still shell-shocked, but they did not. Given a respite, the Polish garrison recovered their equilibrium and re-established their defense. Oberstleutnant Haenke's assault pioneer detachment, equipped with flamethrowers and demolitions charges, arrived on morning of September 3rd. The Germans conducts only minor patrolling and harassing fire against Westerplatte on 3 to 5 September. On the Westerplatte, Henry Sieczarski was still strapped to a bed in his bunker. His men were still being pounded daily by German bombs and shells, and they were still holding out. The incessant bombardment had inflicted few casualties, but it had wreaked terrible destruction on the peninsula. On September 6th, the Germans twice failed to set the woods on Westerplatte afire, but had greater success when they brought up a battery 21 cm Morser 16 howitzers from the First World War. These weapons, designed to defeat fortifications, inflicted considerable damage on the Polish positions. The Germans finally decided to mount another major assault against Westerplatte on September 7th, beginning at 4:22 a.m. with another bombardment by the Schleswig-Holstein. By this point, most of the tree cover on Westerplatte was down and the Germans could better observe Polish positions. Rather than the big 28 cm guns, it was lighter 8.8 cm guns that were able to accurately engage the now visible Polish positions. At 5 a.m., Haenke's assault pioneers attacked, along with the troops from the SS Heimwehr Danzig and the remaining MSK troops. Haenke succeeded in knocking out one of the key Polish positions with flamethrowers by 8:30 a.m. After days of sobbing and uncontrollable shaking, Henryk Sieczarski had recovered some of his composure. He summoned his men in front of the wrecked barracks. The troops were reluctant to surrender. "Someone will still rescue us here," they pleaded with their major. "We can endure for one more day." For the first time, the major told his men about the plight of their comrades, that the Germans were at the gates of Warsaw, that Poland was being overrun. Finally, Sieczarski and Dąbrowski jointly agreed to surrender around 10 a.m. Shortly before 10 a.m., the white flag was raised for the second time over the depot. On this occasion, it would not be hauled down. An hour later, Germans accepted that surrender. There was a brief prayer for the 15 dead, followed by a soldier's hymn, "Peaceful Calm, Comrade." And then Henryk Sieczarski crossed the German lines to capitulate. Sieczarski surrendered the post to Kleikamp, who allowed the valiant commandant to keep his sword. To the Germans, Sieczarski appeared utterly exhausted, his men scruffy, extremely sullen and demoralized. The peninsula had cost the Reich nearly 300 casualties, but its defenders were treated with respect. As the garrison marched into captivity, German soldiers stood stiffly to attention and saluted. Although the defense of Westerplatte was meaningless in the grand scheme of Fall Weiss, it did demonstrate how unexpected obstinate resistance could upset German plans. The Nazi Germany sometime called this battle as Little Verdun. The White Eagle of Poland had surrendered at last, but not without a truly heroic struggle.